In the early 20th century, as the world shifted under the weight of war and empire, a new consciousness was rising across Africa. The brutal legacy of colonialism, forced labor, land dispossession, cultural erasure, sparked not just resistance, but a powerful dream: freedom. The fight for African independence was not a single event. It was a movement, a wave, a continent-wide storm that stretched across decades and borders. From intellectuals to farmers, from guerrilla fighters to diplomats, Africa's people rose up to reclaim what had been stolen. This is the story of how Africa broke free. Long before the first African nation raised its flag, the idea of a free and united Africa was already taking shape, not in Africa, but in the diaspora. Pan-Africanism was born in the hearts and minds of those who had been taken, African descendants in the Americas, Europe, and the Caribbean. They saw that the struggle of Black people everywhere was connected, and that liberation had to be global. The smoke of World War II still lingers in the air. The cities of Europe lie in ruins. The colonial world is shaken, and from the shadows of empire, a fire begins to burn. In the grey, rain-soaked streets of Manchester, England, Black revolutionaries from across the globe gather. They come not as guests, but as future presidents, ministers, freedom fighters, and architects of a new world. This is the 5th Pan-African Congress, and it will change the course of history. This was not the first Congress. Since 1900, Pan-Africanists had attempted to forge unity across the African world. The first Pan-African Congress, held in London and organized by Trinidadian lawyer Henry Sylvester Williams, was small but historic. It set the tone for intellectual resistance. The second and third, in 1919 and 1921, were led by W.E.B. Du Bois, who saw Pan-Africanism as the bridge between the African diaspora and the continent itself. But these early meetings were dominated by middle-class elites and held in Europe during a time of colonial dominance. Most delegates were cut off from the masses. Their goals were noble, but distant from revolutionary action. The Fourth Congress in 1927 came at a time when Garveyism had electrified the Black world. Though Marcus Garvey himself was not invited, his presence loomed large. His Unia had mobilized millions, built Black-owned institutions, and made the phrase "Africa for the Africans" a rallying cry. But his clashes with Du Bois reflected deeper tensions between elite integration and grassroots power. By 1945, a new generation had emerged. They had been shaped by economic depression, fascism, and war. They were no longer satisfied with gradual reform or polite appeals to empire. They demanded full independence now. Black soldiers from Africa, the Caribbean, and the United States fought and died across Europe, North Africa, and Asia. They defended democracies that denied them basic rights. In return, they were promised inclusion, opportunity, and dignity. But when the war ended, they returned to colonial exploitation, Jim Crow, and segregated armies. The disillusionment was deep. The hypocrisy of empire was now undeniable. The war also weakened colonial powers. Britain and France emerged victorious, but bankrupt. Anti-fascist rhetoric had exposed the moral contradictions of colonization. The world was watching. Into this moment stepped the organizers of the 5th Pan-African Congress, ready to capitalize on imperial weakness and global attention. W.E.B. Du Bois returned as the elder statesman, but the younger generation took the lead. They declared that the era of colonial rule was over and that Africa would govern itself. The Congress called for mass civil disobedience, labor strikes, and political organizing across the continent. World War II had shattered Europe. Britain, France, and Belgium were bankrupt and weakened. African soldiers who fought in the war returned home with new resolve, demanding the rights they had defended overseas. The 5th Pan-African Congress lit the spark. The liberation fires were now burning. The Congress opened in October 1945 in Manchester, an industrial British city full of labor movements and leftist energy. Over 200 delegates attended, including workers, students, activists, and veterans. Kwame Nkrumah, the future president of Ghana, was just 36. Born in the Gold Coast, educated in the United States, he studied radical politics, philosophy, and Black liberation at Lincoln University and the University of Pennsylvania. He had marched, organized, and published alongside African Americans. He believed in continental unity, a United States of Africa. Jomo Kenyatta from Kenya had lived in London for over a decade. A cultural anthropologist and political organizer, he gave speeches on the theft of African land and the violence of British rule. Later, he would become Kenya's first prime minister. Amy Ashwood Garvey, the first wife of Marcus Garvey, was a Pan-African feminist who pushed for women's rights and representation. She reminded the Congress that liberation could not be complete without the voices of black women. And at the center of it all stood W.E.B. Du Bois, 77 years old, a living bridge to the movement's beginnings. Having led earlier Congresses, he now stood back, watching a new generation take the lead. He gave the opening address, calling for organized international resistance to imperialism. This was no academic gathering. The Congress adopted fierce resolutions: immediate independence for African colonies, workers' rights and unionization, land redistribution to benefit the people, universal access to education, end of racial discrimination, empowerment of black women. They named specific colonies: Kenya, Nigeria, the Gold Coast, the Caribbean, and demanded British withdrawal. Unlike prior Congresses, this one had teeth. It was grounded in mass movements and backed by veterans and unions. The global black working class had a seat at the table. The resolutions passed in Manchester did not sit on shelves. They became political programs. Within 12 years, more than a dozen African countries had gained independence. In 1957, Kwame Nkrumah led Ghana to freedom, the first sub-Saharan African nation to do so. His party's slogan, "Self-Government Now," came directly from the Manchester meeting. He later stated that the Fifth Pan-African Congress was the beginning of the end of colonialism. Nigeria, Guinea, Senegal, Congo, Mali, and others soon followed. Kenyatta would lead Kenya to independence in 1963. Trinidad and Jamaica would break from Britain. Everywhere the tide was turning. The Congress also laid the ideological foundation for the Organization of African Unity, OAU, in 1963, now the African Union. 63, the Organization of African Unity, OAU, was founded in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. It brought together independent African states under a shared vision of solidarity and cooperation. While it lacked enforcement power, the OAU laid the groundwork for future collaboration. Pan-Africanism wasn't just political, it was cultural. African nations sought to reclaim their heritage, languages, and philosophies. Negritude, led by thinkers like Senghor and Aimé Césaire, celebrated black identity and culture. Writers like Chinua Achebe and Ngugi wa Thiong'o broke colonial narratives and redefined African literature. Poets, painters, and musicians began to reclaim African identity. The Congress helped birth the Black Arts Movement, Afro-Caribbean nationalism, and African socialist thought. In the Caribbean, it inspired figures like Eric Williams and Walter Rodney. In the United States, young radicals in SNCC and the Black Panthers drew on Pan-Africanism. Malcolm X would visit Africa in the early 1960s and echo the very themes of Manchester. From Manchester to Accra, from the Congo to the Caribbean, black people had a new vocabulary: liberation, unity, sovereignty. Some African nations gained independence through negotiation. Others had to fight. In Kenya, the Mau Mau Rebellion emerged in the 1950s. As the Kikuyu people rose up against British colonial rule and land theft, the British responded with mass detentions and executions. But the uprising shattered the myth of British benevolence and paved the way for independence in 1963. In Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau, anti-colonial movements fought prolonged wars against Portuguese forces, backed by global allies. The PAC, MPLA, and Frelimo led decades-long guerrilla campaigns that ultimately forced Portugal to abandon its empire after the Carnation Revolution in 1974. Across the continent, armed struggle became a pathway to freedom. In Nigeria, leaders like Nnamdi Azikiwe and Obafemi Awolowo built strong regional parties and lobbied the British for a gradual handover of power. After a series of constitutional reforms, Nigeria achieved independence in 1960. In Senegal, Léopold Senghor negotiated a peaceful transition from French rule in 1960. In Tanzania, Julius Nyerere's TANU party laid the foundation for a stable post-colonial state. But even in these so-called peaceful transitions, there were deep struggles over who would govern, how the state would be structured, and how much of the economy would remain in foreign hands. In Zambia, foreign firms dominated the copper belt. In Nigeria, British oil companies remained deeply entrenched. In Kenya, European settlers kept vast tracts of fertile farmland. In Francophone Africa, France established monetary control through the CFA franc and maintained military bases under so-called cooperation agreements. These were not just acts of strategy, they were acts of sabotage. Independence came, but sovereignty remained incomplete. Cold War tensions turned Africa into a battleground for US and Soviet influence. Resources were extracted, dictators were armed, foreign debt skyrocketed, but the dream endured. Today, Africa continues to struggle with the legacy of colonialism, but it also continues to build. From the African Union to ECOWAS, regional organizations are strengthening cooperation. African nations are asserting more control over their resources, renegotiating mining contracts, and investing in local industry. Education is expanding, technology is spreading, civil society is organizing, diaspora communities are returning, bringing investment and global networks. A new generation of Africans is writing the next chapter, not in the shadow of empire, but in the light of possibility. Independence was never the end, it was the beginning. The Pan-African vision lives on, in the fight for economic justice, environmental sustainability, and cultural dignity. The dream of self-determination, forged in the fires of resistance, remains Africa's guiding light. This is not just history, it is a mission. Because freedom, real freedom, is not just about raising a flag, it's about raising a people. Thanks for watching. If you found this story insightful, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue uncovering the hidden truths of history. Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and we'll see you in the next video.